Before we begin, there is an important note for you as a viewer. The images and footage in this video will not follow the narration word by word. They will not illustrate each sentence in a precise, literal way. Instead, you will see a loose, atmospheric stream of photographs and archival fragments. Village roads drowned in mud, factory chimneys, cramped apartments, endless lines for food. Children in institutions, parades on gray boulevards, the massive palace in Bucharest, and the faces of people who once lived under this regime. These visuals are there to immerse you in the era, to let you feel the heaviness of that time, not to match every line of this story. If you appreciate this slow, dark documentary format, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment. Tell us if you want more long, brutal biographies of real dictators and which figures from history you would like to see next. Now we go back in time, back to a muddy village in southern Romania, to a boy who was born into hunger and fear, and who later turned an entire country into a reflection of his own hard, violent inner world. This was the life of Nicolae Ceausescu, and beside him, Elena. Nicolae Ceausescu was born on January 26, 1918 in the village of Scornicești in Olt County, Romania. At that time, Scornicești was a poor, harsh place, a cluster of peasant houses built from mud, wood, and desperation. His family lived in a cramped dwelling with dirt floors, smoke-blackened walls, and a stove that never quite defeated the cold. The air inside often smelled of damp clothes, sweat, and rough homemade alcohol. His father, Nicolae Ceausescu, had a reputation not as a gentle provider, but as a violent and authoritarian man. He drank, he shouted, and he hit. He ruled his household with fists and curses. The children learned very early that a misplaced word, a broken plate, or a simple childish complaint could be enough to trigger an explosion of rage. In that house, tenderness was rare. Affection did not flow through kind words or soft gestures. Most of the time, communication meant orders, insults, and the sound of something heavy hitting a table, a wall, or a body. Nicolae grew up in an environment where fear was the main organizing force. He learned to keep his head down, to hide his feelings, to anticipate his father's moods the way animals sense a coming storm. Alongside this private terror, there was the constant presence of poverty. His family scraped by as poor peasants in a country still dominated by landlords, large estates, and rigid social hierarchies. Hunger was a regular visitor. Sometimes there was bread. Sometimes there was only thin soup with a few pieces of potato floating in it. And sometimes there was nothing but water to fill the emptiness in their stomachs. From an early age, Nicolae worked in the fields. He walked barefoot in muddy furrows, drove animals, carried loads, and did whatever a small, unnerved body could do. Winter meant frozen fingers, numb toes, and the bitter wind cutting through worn clothing. Summer meant endless heat, sweat soaked into his shirt, and a sun that seemed determined to push him into the ground. School existed, but it was fragile and secondary. He learned basic reading and writing, just enough to navigate simple texts. The classroom was not a sanctuary, it was a short pause before work resumed. Books did not open vast worlds for him because there were so few books and so little time. What imprinted itself deeply was not knowledge of literature or philosophy, but the lesson that power flowed from the ability to command and punish. Humiliation soaked those early years. He saw richer peasants with better clothes, more land, more animals, more bread on their table. He felt the sting of being less, of living at the bottom of a social order in which someone like his father would always be dependent and resentful. Inside, resentment began to grow, a hard knot forming under layers of fear and obedience. As a teenager, he left Scornicești for Bucharest. He did not go chasing a dream, he went fleeing a trap. He became a shoemaker's apprentice in the capital, one more peasant boy thrown into the industrial world. Bucharest at that time was a city of contrasts. Wide boulevards and elegant cafes for the elite, and crowded, filthy worker neighborhoods for people like Nicolae. He lived in those poor districts and shared rooms with other young workers and apprentices. The air inside those rooms was thick with smoke, wet clothes, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Mattresses were thin, blankets full of lice, and privacy practically non-existent. In the workshop, he spent long days bent over shoes and boots, hands stained by glue and dyes, lungs filled with dust and chemical fumes. The master could insult or strike apprentices at will. The hierarchy was simple and brutal. Those above shouted and hit, those below obeyed and swallowed their anger. It was in this environment that Nicolae first encountered communist ideas. In the 1930s, the Romanian Communist Party was illegal, hunted by the authorities, small and underground. But precisely because it was persecuted, it attracted people who felt crushed by the existing order. In back rooms, in courtyards, in corners of workers' neighborhoods, young activists met in secret. They passed around crude pamphlets printed with cheap ink. Pages were filled with portraits of Lenin and Stalin, with slogans about equality, workers' power, and the overthrow of landlords and capitalists. They spoke about the Soviet Union as a model, a place where the poor had supposedly taken control of their destiny, for a boy who had grown up under a violent father and in grinding poverty. These ideas were intoxicating. Communism told him that his suffering had a cause, an unjust system, an exploitative class. It promised that the world could be turned upside down, that peasants and workers could one day stand on top. He joined the communist youth. He attended clandestine meetings, memorized slogans, carried leaflets. He was not a thinker, he was a disciplined activist. He followed orders, ran small risks, and proved himself reliable. The police eventually noticed. The monarchy and its security forces treated communists as dangerous enemies. Nicolae was arrested several times, accused of distributing illegal propaganda, of organizing or supporting strikes, of undermining public order. Each stint in police custody reinforced his sense of being a soldier in a war. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a victim of a rotten regime. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s and Europe slid into war, repression intensified. Romania aligned itself with Nazi Germany, and the authorities became even more paranoid about internal enemies. Ceausescu's arrests led to longer prison terms. Prison ceased to be a temporary interruption and became a formative environment. Romanian prisons during those years were brutal institutions. Cells were overcrowded, walls were damp and cracked, bedding was infested with lice, food was poor and insufficient, often barely enough to keep the prisoners alive. Violence was constant, from guards, from criminal inmates, from the entire structure of humiliation and control. For political prisoners, there were also interrogations, hours and hours of questioning, repeated again and again, sometimes accompanied by beatings, sometimes by threats directed at their families. The goal was not just to extract information, it was to break personalities, to reduce individuals to tired, frightened bodies who would say anything just to make the ordeal stop. And yet, inside this hell, communist leaders built their own hierarchy. In prisons like Doftana, Jilava, Karanseed, cells filled with activists and party members became informal universities. Georg Udea, who later became the country's leader, was one of the central figures. He organized clandestine study circles, lectured on Marxism-Leninism, and maintained a strict internal discipline. Nicolae Ceausescu moved within this world. He listened, he learned, he watched how authority operated inside the cell. Dissent was not allowed, even in prison. Those who questioned the party line, even slightly, risked isolation, moral pressure, and denunciation. A man who dared to ask wrong questions could suddenly find himself shunned by his own fellow prisoners, erased by the small community on which he depended. From this, Ceausescu drew lessons. He saw that fear worked. He saw that intimidation and group pressure could enforce obedience more effectively than reason. He internalized the idea that once a line was set by the leadership, it had to be obeyed by everyone without exception. Prison did not humanize him, it hardened him. The Second World War shifted the balance of power in Europe. Romania's alliance with Nazi Germany brought it into the war against the Soviet Union. But as the tide turned, the regime of Marshal Ion Antonescu collapsed. In August 1944, a royal coup removed Antonescu, and soon the Red Army entered Romanian territory in force. In the years that followed, the Romanian Communist Party, once illegal and marginal, rose step by step towards dominance under the protective shadow of Soviet power. For men like Ceausescu, freed from prison in a world suddenly favorable to their cause, this was the moment when the discipline and loyalty forged in those cells turned into political capital. They were seen as tested cadres, people who had suffered for the party and could be trusted with responsibility in the new order. He was given roles in the youth organizations, in the army, in the party apparatus. He learned how the machinery of the new state functioned at different levels. He supervised cadres, delivered slogans, and forced decisions. He climbed upward not because he was brilliant, but because he was obedient, tough, and always ready to prove his loyalty. Above him, Gheorghiu consolidated power and led Romania into its Stalinist phase. The late 1940s and the 1950s were years of purges, show trials, collectivization, and forced labor. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, grew into a powerful institution, spreading fear across cities and villages. Ceausescu was part of this system. He played roles in overseeing agriculture, which meant involvement in collectivization campaigns. Collectivization meant forcing peasants to give up their land, livestock, and tools to join collective farms. It meant campaigns where party activists arrived with police and sometimes army units, organized meetings in village halls, and pressured or terrorized people into signing away their property. He saw peasants who had worked the same fields for generations cry as their animals were led away. He heard curses, pleas, and desperate bargaining. He chose the side of the state, not the side of those whose lives were being dismantled. For him, this was necessary sacrifice, class struggle, the path to socialism. In prisons like Peteti, the regime carried out its horrifying re-education experiment, forcing prisoners to torture one another, to degrade and destroy their fellow inmates in order to reshape them into obedient tools. On the Danube-Black Sea Canal, thousands of political prisoners and other undesirables were worked to exhaustion and death on a grand construction site that stood as a monument to human suffering and ideological fanaticism. Ceausescu was not the architect of these particular horrors, but he belonged to the leadership that sustained and justified them. He never condemned them, never broke with the system that produced them. For him, the terror of the early communist years was a normal, legitimate instrument of state building. During this period, his personal life also took shape. He married Elena Petrescu, a woman from a similar rural background. She did not have a serious education. What she had was burning ambition and a deep resentment towards those who did. Elena disliked people with real learning and refinement. Intellectuals, those who spoke foreign languages, those who came from old educated families, stood in her mind as rivals and threats. Her own insecurities fed a kind of cold hatred for those who reminded her of what she lacked. Through party connections, she pushed herself into positions in scientific institutions, particularly in chemistry. Her academic career was built on fear and obedience, not on discovery and rigor. Articles were prepared for her, titles bestowed on her, all because everyone understood that to deny her or to publicly question her achievements would be dangerous. Together, Nicolae and Elena formed a couple bound by power, not by culture or generosity. They adored their own status, their own image. They fed each other's illusions and didn't tolerate contradiction. Over time, their marriage and their family became an axis around which the state itself would be forced to rotate. By the early 1960s, Ceausescu had reached the upper levels of the party leadership. He was a Central Committee member, a Politburo member, responsible for key sectors. He remained loyal to Gheorghiu, never positioning himself as an open rival. When Gheorghiu died in 1965, the party needed a successor. Several prominent figures had greater experience and stature, but they were divided by rivalries, by memories of purges, by fears of one another. Nicolae Ceausescu, younger and apparently modest, appeared as a compromise candidate. He seemed controllable. He did not seem original or particularly dangerous. He was chosen as first secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. Over the next years, he consolidated his position, becoming general secretary, head of state, and the central figure of the regime. The compromise candidate turned into the core of a new dictatorship. At first, his rule looked more flexible than the harshest Stalinist years. Some prisoners were released. Censorship eased slightly. Ceausescu used nationalism to present himself as a leader who cared about Romania's sovereignty, not just about Moscow's directives. His most spectacular move came in August 1968. when the Soviet Union and its allies invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. Ceausescu refused to participate. He stood on a balcony in Bucharest and denounced the intervention in front of a massive crowd. His speech was broadcast and echoed beyond Romania. For many Romanians, this moment brought genuine pride. They saw a Romanian leader who defied Moscow. In the West, Ceausescu suddenly became a special communist, a supposed maverick who could be courted as a counterweight to Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Western leaders invited him. He walked through the gardens of foreign palaces, rode in limousines, received handshakes and honors. Credits and loans flowed into Romania from Western banks and governments, financing ambitious plans for industrialization and development. While he shook hands abroad, the secret police remained active at home. The one-party system remained intact. The prisons did not vanish. But the harshest terror of the early 1950s gave way to a more sophisticated mix of propaganda, controlled nationalism, and selective repression. The mask of independent communism covered the same core obsession: control. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Romania launched new heavy industries and built new urban neighborhoods. Concrete blocks rose on the edges of cities, filled with working-class families who left villages for factory jobs. At the same time, Ceausescu decided to interfere in the most intimate sphere of human life: reproduction. In 1966, Decree 770 was introduced. It nearly banned abortion and drastically restricted contraception. Abortion, which had been relatively accessible, became illegal for most women under the age of 40 who had fewer than a specified number of children. Contraceptive pills and devices simply disappeared from the shelves. The state declared a demographic battle. Romania, they said, needed more children, more workers, more soldiers, more builders of socialism. This policy did not come with real social support. There were no adequate measures to increase housing, food, or basic services for the larger families the state wanted to create. Instead, there was surveillance and coercion. Women were subjected to regular mandatory gynecological examinations at workplaces and in institutions. Long lines formed in cold, impersonal corridors. Women waited, sometimes half-dressed in hospital gowns, for a nurse or a doctor to call their name. There was no real concern for their dignity or consent. Their bodies were treated as resources to be measured, registered, and controlled. Those who were found pregnant were put on lists and monitored. If the pregnancy did not end with a birth, questions followed, often accompanied by accusations of illegal abortion. Punishments could include prison, fines, job loss, and the permanent mark of being an enemy of the state's demographic policy. In cramped apartments, already strained by shortages, this policy turned everyday life into a nightmare. Couples who could barely feed the children they already had faced the threat of pregnancies they could not support. Some accepted their fate and sank deeper into poverty. Others decided that they could not, under any circumstance, bring another child into that situation. Illegal abortions flourished in a dark and dangerous underground. Women went to apartments where the curtains stayed drawn. They lay on tables covered with old sheets, while someone, sometimes a nurse, sometimes just a person with a bit of knowledge and a lot of risk, used instruments that were often poorly sterilized, improvised, and unsafe. The pain was severe. The fear of being discovered hung over everything. If complications arose, going to a hospital meant risking denunciation, but staying away meant risking death. Some women returned home in agony with fevers and internal bleeding. They tried to hide their condition from neighbors and colleagues. Sometimes their husbands watched them grow weaker day after day, unable to decide between calling an ambulance and protecting them from exposure. In too many cases, these stories ended with late-night trips to hospitals, desperate attempts by doctors to save lives, and then funerals wrapped in silence and lies. Children were left motherless. They asked where their mothers had gone. They were given vague answers. She died in the hospital. She was very sick, but the real cause remained buried under fear and stigma. At the same time, the number of unwanted children rose. Some families simply could not cope. They turned to the state, handing over babies and toddlers to orphanages and children's homes. Behind the closed doors of many such institutions, another horror unfolded. Rows of metal cribs held babies and toddlers with shaved heads, thin limbs, and eyes that stared at nothing in particular. There were a few caretakers. The staff were exhausted, underpaid, and often overwhelmed. Feeding time became a mechanical routine. A bottle pushed into a mouth, a spoon quickly scraped across gums, then the child laid down again. There was no time for smiles, for lullabies, for gentle words. Some children were tied to beds or chairs to prevent them from falling or wandering. They rocked their bodies back and forth, their only way of generating a sensation in a world of emotional blankness. Deprived of stimulation and affection, many fell behind in development. They did not speak on time. They did not walk on time. Some never fully caught up. All of this happened in a country where the official propaganda spoke endlessly about the love of the party for the new generation, about the care that the state supposedly provided for children and families. While the real children lay in iron cribs, Ceausescu and Elena presented themselves as the parents of the nation. The cult of personality grew decade after decade. Portraits of Nicolae Ceausescu and of Elena appeared everywhere, in classrooms, factories, hospital corridors, office walls, military barracks. Giant images looked down on city squares from banners and billboards. Slogans praised his genius, his historic mission, his brilliant thinking. He was described as the genius of the Carpathians, the Danube of thought. Elena was called the mother of the nation, a world-renowned scientist, the greatest savant of our epoch. The language grew more absurd, but no one dared laugh aloud. Children were taught poems in his honor. They were brought together on schoolyards, standing in lines in cold air, to chant synchronized slogans for Comrade Ceausescu and for Comrade Elena. They clapped their hands until they hurt. Teachers watched carefully for any lack of enthusiasm, for any child whose voice was not loud enough, whose face did not reflect the correct reverence. Elena's fake scientific career continued upward. She received titles, honorary degrees, and academy memberships. Real scientists were forced to applaud her, to cite her works, to pretend that she had made extraordinary contributions. In meetings, she insulted researchers, humiliated professors, and dismissed genuine expertise with contempt. The message was clear. Loyalty to the ruling family mattered more than merit, more than truth. The state itself began to look like a family business. Relatives of the Ceausescus occupied high positions in ministerial offices, in embassies, in enterprises. Their son Nicu was treated as a prince, a potential heir. He enjoyed privileges that ordinary Romanians could not imagine. While the family lived in villas, traveled, and shopped in special stores with imported goods, the country's economy slid toward disaster. The loans taken in the 1970s had to be repaid. Instead of negotiating a gradual solution, Ceausescu decided to pay off the foreign debt as quickly as possible. He turned this into a crusade, a national mission. To do so, the regime intensified exports of food, energy, and industrial products. Goods that could have fed or warmed the population were shipped abroad to earn hard currency. Inside the country, rationing tightened. Supermarket shelves empty. Meat, butter, sugar, cooking oil, even bread became scarce. People woke early to stand in queues. At 4 in the morning, long lines formed under dark winter skies. Men and women stood wrapped in coats and scarves, stomping their feet to keep feeling in their toes. No one knew exactly what would arrive at the store. They only knew that if they did not stand in that line, they might go home with nothing. Inside the stores, the atmosphere was tense. Workers behind the counter were caught between orders from above and the desperation of those in front of them. Goods often arrived in small quantities. People argued about who was first, who had cut the line, and who had connections to get a little more. Sometimes the doors closed while dozens waited outside, told that everything was gone. In many apartments, the food that did make it home was carefully divided. Parents ate less so that children could have more. A mother might say that she had already eaten at work, that she was not hungry, while quietly pushing her share toward a child. Hunger, embarrassment, and forced sacrifice became everyday realities. Heating was restricted as well. Radiators barely warmed. Some remained entirely cold for long stretches of winter. People slept in sweaters, jackets, and hats, breathing out clouds of visible breath into the air of their own bedrooms. Hot water was available only rarely and briefly. Electricity was cut frequently, sometimes without warning. Low-wattage bulbs cast thin, inadequate light over rooms where families huddled around small tables, trying to stretch both food and warmth. Television broadcasts were reduced to a couple of hours in the evening. Most of that time was devoted to praising the leader, showing his visits to factories and farms, his speeches at party congresses, his meetings with foreign guests. Ordinary Romanians sat in front of flickering screens, cold and exhausted, watching a reality that had almost nothing to do with their own daily struggle. Amid this, Ceausescu launched the grand project of reshaping Bucharest. He decided to demolish large parts of the old city to build a monumental center worthy, in his mind, of his historic role. Inspired by a mixture of megalomania and ideological symbolism, he ordered entire neighborhoods to be torn down. Streets that had existed for centuries, lined with houses, churches, small shops, and gardens, were marked for destruction. Officials came with documents and deadlines. Residents were told that their homes would be demolished, and that they would be moved into new apartment blocks on the outskirts. Sometimes they had weeks to prepare. Sometimes they had days. Sometimes only hours. Imagine a family whose grandparents and parents had lived in the same house, with vines climbing over the courtyard, with memories in every room. They were forced to pack their lives into boxes and bags under the gaze of authorities, and the impatient growl of bulldozers waiting outside. As soon as the last belongings were carried out, the machines moved in. Walls were crushed, roofs collapsed, trees were torn from the ground. Dust and rubble filled the space where lives had unfolded. In their place, wide boulevards were carved out, and at the center rose the House of the People, one of the largest administrative buildings in the world, filled with marble, crystal, and grand halls. It was built while the population stood in lines for food and shivered in their apartments. The contrast between the luxury of that colossal construction and the deprivation outside made the cruelty of the regime impossible to ignore. To preserve this world of contrasts, the regime relied on the Securitate, its omnipresent security apparatus. By the 1980s, Romania had become a state where almost everyone suspected that almost everything could be watched or recorded. Telephones were tapped, offices and apartments were bugged, letters were opened, read, and sometimes never delivered. Informers reported on conversations at work, in stairwells, in cafes, in trains. No one knew for sure who was an informer, but everyone had their suspicions. In this atmosphere, people learned to speak in code, to lower their voices even in their own homes, to glance at the ceiling or at the walls before saying anything critical of the leader or the party. One of the most frightening aspects was the way fear entered families. Imagine a father who returned home after hours spent queuing for food. He sat at a wobbly kitchen table, looked at the small piece of meat and bread in front of him, and suddenly, tired and angry, whispered a bitter comment about that man in Bucharest who lived in luxury while his people suffered. At the table, his young child listened. The next day at school, the teacher asked if anyone had heard their parents say bad things about the party or the leader. The child, still innocent, raised a hand and repeated what the father had said. Soon, the father received a summons. He was called in to speak with officials, maybe from the party, maybe from Securitate. They sat across from him in a small room, their voices calm, their eyes cold. They quoted his words with eerie precision. They asked him why he spoke like that, whether he realized the impact of his words, whether he wished to harm his child's future. Without raising their voices, they made it clear that his behavior could affect whether his child would be allowed to attend university, to get a good job, to have a normal life. He left the room smaller than when he had entered, with the knowledge that his home was no longer fully his, that even his children's ears could become instruments of the state. Despite this suffocating climate, anger accumulated. Workers, supposedly the leading class in the socialist rhetoric, saw their living standards nosedive. They saw their factories mismanaged and undersupplied, their wages eroded by shortages and inflation. They watched as the leadership continued to praise victories and progress that existed mostly on paper. On November 15, 1987, in the city of Brasov, this anger finally spilled into the open. Workers at the Stiegel Sibiru truck factory and other industrial plants went on strike over unpaid wages and lack of food. The strike turned into a march. Thousands of workers moved through the streets toward the city center. As they marched, their slogans changed. They no longer spoke only of salaries and food. They shouted, "Down with Ceausescu! Down with communism!" Party offices were attacked. Portraits of Ceausescu were torn down, ripped, and thrown into the mud. The regime reacted swiftly and violently. Security forces moved in. Protesters were beaten, arrested, interrogated. Rather than stage public trials, the authorities chose more discreet forms of punishment. Many of those involved were transferred to other cities, demoted, or pushed into menial jobs. Their families were uprooted. Their names were quietly written into blacklists. Brasov was a warning, a crack in the fog. But Ceausescu did not listen. If anything, he entrenched himself further, convinced that only more discipline, more control, could hold things together. 2 years later, the entire structure collapsed. In December 1989, events in Timisoara, a city in western Romania, triggered the chain reaction that would end the dictatorship. The immediate cause was an attempt by the authorities to remove a dissident pastor, LSZLTKS, from his parish. Members of his congregation gathered to defend him. Soon, other citizens joined them. What began as a protest in defense of a single man quickly expanded into a broader challenge to the regime. People started chanting for freedom, for an end to Ceausescu's rule, for an end to shortages and lies. The local authorities responded as the regime had always done. They brought in security forces and military units. They attempted to clear the streets by force. Tear gas, batons, and water cannons were used. Then, under orders, soldiers and Securitate units opened fire on demonstrators. Gunshots rang out in the cold December air. People fell. Others tried to carry the wounded to safety. Into hallways, into parked cars, into improvised shelters. Hospitals filled with injured bodies. Doctors worked frantically, sometimes under the watchful gaze of officers who wanted more information about who had been there than about how to preserve every life. Families rushed from hospital to hospital searching for missing loved ones. Some found them on operating tables, in crowded wards in the morgue. Others did not find them at all. Those who disappeared were sometimes taken away secretly, their bodies transported at night, buried or burned without witnesses. Rumors spread through Timisoara and beyond. People spoke of mass graves, of trucks moving bodies under cover of darkness. Although information was incomplete and confused, the key fact could no longer be hidden. The regime had shot into crowds of its own citizens. Ceausescu was in Tehran on an official visit when the unrest began. He returned to a country that was already different from the one he had left. He believed that he could restore control through the old theater of mass mobilization. On December 21, 1989, a large rally was organized in Bucharest. Workers were brought in from factories, students from universities, state employees from offices. They filled Palace Square in front of the Central Committee building. Banners and flags were distributed. Television cameras were set up for live broadcast. Ceausescu stepped onto the balcony wearing his familiar hat and coat. For a brief moment, everything looked as it always had. He began his speech, condemning the hooligans and foreign agents in Timisoara, praising the greatness of socialism, calling on the crowd to defend the revolution. Then something unprecedented happened. In the sea of people, a disturbance rose. First a murmur, then shouts, then boos. Someone started yelling against him. Others joined. The noise grew. On live television, the cameras captured his face as he realized that the crowd was no longer under control. For a second, his expression changed completely. The accustomed mask of confidence gave way to bewilderment and fear. He raised his hand, tried to calm the crowd, called out "Allo, allo," as if the microphone were malfunctioning and not the entire script of his rule. The broadcast was cut. For those who saw it, those few seconds were etched into memory as the instant when the illusion collapsed. The endless applause, the choreographed chants, the obedience, all of it could crumble in a single moment when people stopped playing their roles. That night, Bucharest became a battlefield. Barricades went up. Shots were fired. Protesters and security forces clashed. Some army units began to refuse orders to fire on civilians. The situation became chaotic, with conflicting commands, rumors of coups, and fear traveling through the streets as fast as any bullet. On December 22nd, the tipping point was reached. The army's high command signaled that it would not continue to support Ceausescu unconditionally. Crowds converged on the Central Committee building. Party officials ran through hallways that had once felt secure, looking for ways out. Ceausescu and Elena went up to the roof. A helicopter was waiting. They climbed aboard and flew away from the building where they had ruled for decades. For a few hours, they traveled over a country that they no longer controlled. They tried to reach units they believed might remain loyal. They issued orders and tried to regain their grip on the situation, but the web of power they had woven for so long was tearing itself apart. The helicopter eventually landed near Târgoviște. Ceausescu attempted to continue his escape by car, but his movements were tracked. Soon he and Elena were taken into custody by army units who viewed them not as leaders, but as fleeing culprits. They were brought to a military garrison in Târgoviște and kept under guard. Meanwhile, in Bucharest, a new provisional leadership emerged from the turmoil. They decided that Ceausescu and his wife had to be judged quickly. They feared that loyalist forces might attempt to rescue them or that prolonged uncertainty would deepen the chaos. On December 25, 1989, Christmas Day, a hastily constituted tribunal was formed in the barracks. In a small room with cold walls and simple furniture, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu sat on chairs, facing judges and officers. They were disheveled, strained, no longer surrounded by courtiers and propagandists, but by men who questioned them as defendants. The charges included genocide, undermining the national economy, and abusing power. The trial was improvised, rushed, lacking the balance and rigor of normal legal proceedings. Yet, in a symbolic sense, it represented the moment when, after decades of exercising absolute power over others, they were finally confronted with a verdict they could not control. Ceausescu refused to recognize the authority of the court. He insisted that he was still the president of Romania, that only the great National Assembly had the right to judge him. He clung to titles as if they could shield him from the reality unfolding around him. He repeated slogans about the revolution, about the people, as if incantations could turn back time. Elena responded with insults, calling the judges traitors, denying any guilt, claiming that they had done everything for the good of the people. There was no remorse, no introspection, only a reflexive defense of their myth. The verdict was death by firing squad. There was no real doubt about what the outcome would be. Soon after the sentence, they were led outside to a concrete courtyard. A wall, weathered by years, stood as the last backdrop of their lives. Soldiers positioned themselves. There was no international tribunal, no long philosophical speeches. The end came quickly, with the crack of automatic weapons. The couple who had forced a nation to applaud them for decades, who had demanded parades, poems, and portraits, died in seconds in a small military yard. Their execution took place on Christmas Day, a day that the regime had long tried to drain of religious meaning, reducing it to a vague winter celebration. Now the news of their trial and death spread through Romania and the world. As people gathered with families, as churches celebrated the birth of Christ, for many Romanians, this coincidence gave the event a powerful symbolic charge, the fall of a dictatorship, on a day of hope and renewal. In the weeks and months that followed, the full extent of what had happened during their rule began to surface more clearly. Orphanages were opened to the eyes of foreign journalists and humanitarian workers, who were horrified by the conditions they saw. Securitate files revealed the density of the surveillance web, the betrayals, the manipulations, the way fear had twisted relationships between neighbors, colleagues, even family members. The House of the People stood in the center of Bucharest like a stranded ship of stone, absurdly massive, a physical reminder of how far one man's megalomania had been allowed to go. It had been built while ordinary people had queued for food and fuel, their lives sacrificed to a fantasy of grandeur. The story of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was, in the end, not only the story of two individuals who rose from poverty to absolute power. It was also the story of how an entire state apparatus could be shaped by fear, ideology, and the worship of a leader. It showed how personal trauma, resentment, and hunger for control could expand outward until they engulfed millions of lives. Nicolae's childhood, marked by his father's brutality and by hunger, did not justify what he later did, but it helped explain how man could come to believe that violence and intimidation were natural tools of governance. The prison years reinforced this belief, teaching him that loyalty could be extracted through fear, that dissent had to be crushed completely. Elena's lifelong insecurity and hatred of genuine intellect turned her into a driving force. Behind the regime's contempt for expertise and independent thought, she used her position to elevate mediocrity and punish real talent, to transform science and education into theater. Their rule left behind a landscape of broken lives, women who died on the invisible front line of Decree 770, children whose first years were spent in neglectful institutions, families who froze and starved in their own homes, workers beaten and scattered after daring to protest in Brasov, victims of bullets on the streets of Timisoara and Bucharest. Their fall did not erase the damage. The scars remained, in memories, in institutions, in the very language people used when they talked about power and fear. But the end of their regime opened the possibility of remembering and speaking without whispering, of telling stories that had once been dangerous to tell. Thank you for staying with this long, dark story until the end. If you want more deep, brutal documentaries about real dictators and the systems of fear they built, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment. Tell us which part of Ceausescu's story shocked you the most, and which dictator's life you would like to hear about next in this detailed, unflinching format.